And yet they push on, hoping for a lucky break, hoping that they can get through the next election cycle with it, showing that they're standing up to communism, and then they can look for ways to wind it down or get out. The whole thing was never approached strategically. What is possible? What can we do? If it's not possible, how do we get out and keep our honor intact? It was always just sort of one more step down the road and hope for the best. And as we see, this led us into what was for a very long time America's longest war.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is August 2nd, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin off of Vietnam. 2 American destroyers. And I welcome Geoff Warwo. His new book is exhaustively researched, and he visited many of these sites in Vietnam, including the battlefield of Khe Sanh. 50 years later, the Vietnam War military history. This is a political war, a war of choice by politicians, the most powerful politicians on the planet at the time. Geoff, congratulations. It's a difficult trip because what we didn't know in 1964 and 1968 and 1972, you have mapped very carefully. Tonkin Gulf. Lyndon Johnson was in the White House. Bob McNamara was the Secretary of Defense. What did they see in the Tonkin Gulf that was then conveyed to the Congress for a resolution that was false? We know it is false entirely. It's not even maybe now. It was false. Good evening to you, Geoff.
Hi, John. Good to be with you again. In answer to your question, what did they see in Tonkin Gulf? They saw opportunity. And the whole difficulty for Lyndon Johnson was that he was trying to fight this war very delicately because he didn't want to incentivize a Chinese intervention in the war that would have turned Vietnam into Korea, where the U.S. would have been poised to win, and then the Chinese would have sent hundreds of thousands of troops over the border into North Vietnam and made it an entirely different war that was literally unwinnable. So he was trying to proceed cautiously to kind of soften the North Vietnamese up with surgical airstrikes and the promise of additional aid to South Vietnam, and therefore he thought that the calculation in Hanoi would be, look, we don't really want to get bombed. We don't want to really fight this difficult war against a American armed South Vietnamese army. So let's just go to the peace table, negotiate a 2-state solution, and get on with things. And so because he was pursuing this very delicate policy of trying to intimidate them without invading them or without encouraging any kind of Soviet or Chinese intervention in the war, he was getting a lot of flack from the right, from conservative Southern Democrats and from the Republican Party, saying like Johnson's fighting what they called a no-win war. He's putting in just enough to keep the war going, but not enough to win the war. And you had people who were lining up to run against Lyndon Johnson. He was running against Goldwater in 64, and then there were people who were already positioning themselves to run in 68, like Governor Reagan in California, like Richard Nixon, who were saying that, if I wouldn't be pussyfooting around like this, I'd just go in and get it over with. So Johnson needed some kind of incident that would galvanize everyone and bring everyone onto his team. And he sees opportunity in Tonkin Gulf because he can claim that the North Vietnamese have launched this dastardly attack on the warships of the United States Navy, and that he has no choice but to take whatever measures are necessary to protect U.S. personnel in Southeast Asia. And so they literally invent this North Vietnamese attack on the U.S. ships on the 2nd and then again on the 3rd and 4th of August. 1964, when in fact it was this incident was initiated by the United States, which was running a covert CIA-run program of sending South Vietnamese PT boats into North Vietnamese waters to draw retaliation from the North Vietnamese, which would then be set upon by the better armed U.S. Navy, who would come out in assistance to assist these South Vietnamese torpedo boats. So the Americans kind of concoct the incident. They get the incident they want. Congress responds as bidden, both huge majorities in the Senate and the House, with only like 1 or 2 holdouts, are vote in favor of this Tonkin Gulf resolution, which basically gives the president a blank check to prosecute war in Vietnam, so long as he feels that U.S. personnel are endangered. And because he's now in the process of putting more and more U.S. personnel in addition to the 15,000 advisors already inserted by Kennedy. Now Johnson's put in yet more, and he's now contemplating putting in combat troops. So this Tonkin Gulf resolution gives him a lot of rope to play with.
The backstory here is long-winded. Lyndon Johnson has the presidency because of the assassination of JFK, who inherited the Vietnam quandary from Dwight Eisenhower, who inherited the Vietnam quandary from the French, who bugged out after Dien Bien Phu. That's the best we can do for backstory because we're on to January 65. McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, and Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, both of whom knew that the Tonkin Gulf incident was contrived, told the president he needed to move now, or a disastrous defeat is the quote that you provide, Jeff. And what they're looking for is a U.S. combat commitment. There are incidents, one in February of 65, where there's mortaring of an American base, and the decision is made by Lyndon Johnson to put combat troops into Vietnam. A Marine contingent lands at Da Nang. That's the beginning of the combat. Westmoreland is important here. General Westmoreland is given control of the American troops in Vietnam. What do we need to know about Westmoreland at this point, Jeff?
Well, Westmoreland, is sent out by, to replace Paul Harkins, who was the MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam commander, basically the American field commander in Vietnam. But Harkins has no real field command because there aren't any American combat troops. He's just running the advisory effort. But once he's replaced by General Westmoreland, Westmoreland is now gets the brief from Johnson to actually use ground troops, and this is very hotly debated, in the White House and in Congress. I mean, Kennedy had been dead set against putting in combat troops because he thought this would Americanize the war, and it would just release the South Vietnamese from any responsibility they had to solve their own problems, which were immense. But Johnson just feels he has this real hubristic view that American power is so great that it just couldn't be that hard. We can just send some troops, some aircraft. He talks about touching them up with bombing, and the presence of well-armed, technologically well-equipped American troops in South Vietnam will really bring the North Vietnamese to their senses. So he keeps hoping by putting in these troops, and the troops, he has to put the troops in because in early 1965 there's this constant sequence of bombings and mortarings of American bases. And it's clear that the South Vietnamese military is not good enough to protect these big air bases that the Americans are putting in to backstop the South Vietnamese military. So it's this kind of like chain reaction. You put in the air bases to support the South Vietnamese military against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese infiltrators, and then these bases start getting attacked by Viet Cong sappers and mortarmen and people with rockets. And so then you have to put in American troops to guard the air bases. And then once you have all these American troops to guard the air bases, it's thought, well, why don't we start using them in combat operations? And it's all part of initially in 1965, it's all part of this signaling. It's like the idea that we won't really have to fight a determined war in Vietnam. The mere fact that we're putting these Marines into combat operations will be kind of a sobering lesson for the communists, who will say, whoa, let's not piss off America. If they send more troops and more aircraft, then we're going to really have a problem. So initially, even the limited combat operations at the outset are premised on the fact that this will signal to the North Vietnamese that we're serious, and then they'll slacken their support for the Viet Cong in South Vietnam.
Westmoreland has an idea, which is to seek the enemy and destroy him. We go to the Ia Drang Valley, and an early indication of how the Vietnamese are going to fight. VC is the way they refer to the Viet Cong in the South. The NVA is the way we refer to the army from North Vietnam. There are about 40 million people in the whole of Vietnam, North and South. The majority are in the North with a high birth rate. The South was created after the French withdrawal in an acceptance of a peace dividend. The two sides are not equal, however, in terms of passion. The U.S. gets involved right away, fighting, searching and destroying the NVA. Jeff, the incident in Ia Drang Valley, it's Operation Silver Bayonet, and we come to one particular battalion led by a man named Hal Moore. What happens to it? How does the NVA fight this?
Well, the Battle of Ia Drang, which pulls in the Hal Moore's battalion of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, which is the same battalion that was savaged at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. So it returns for another rough day at the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965, and it's this battle is the centerpiece of what Westmoreland calls his Pleiku campaign. Pleiku is one of the principal towns in the Central Highlands. The Central Highlands is this southern end of the Annamite Range, these big high mountains that go all the way along the North Vietnamese border with Laos and then come down into the tri-border area of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And these are these big peaks. It's through the valleys between them, like Ia Drang, that North Vietnamese regular troops infiltrate into South Vietnam. So until the Americans put in troops in February of '65, the North Vietnamese, would infiltrate small parties of NVA troops to reinforce the Viet Cong. Once the Americans put in troops, they dropped this whole charade of infiltrating, and they literally just start marching down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, either across the DMZ into I Corps, the northernmost part of South Vietnam, or around the DMZ through Laos, and then they branch through the Central Highlands and into South Vietnam as regular NVA regiments, and then they form into NVA divisions inside South Vietnam. So this big escalation, which was predicted by U.S. planners in war games, is what comes to pass once the U.S. puts in ground troops. Another reason why someone like Kennedy and even Johnson initially don't want to put in U.S. troops, because the inevitable result will then, North Vietnam will then just basically declare war and send regular divisions down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and in. So this has already happened. So Westmoreland's plan is, okay, as bad as that is, it offers us an opportunity because we have superior technology. We have superior firepower and mobility. So I can use this new, vertical envelopment concept provided by this air mobile posture. We move everywhere in helicopters now. So we're able to locate the enemy. Well, if we can locate the enemy, we can then set upon the enemy by dropping maneuver companies around him in helicopters to outflank and surround him. And meanwhile, we can just pummel him to death with artillery from our fire bases and from our tactical air support. And so that's the reason for this Operation Silver Bayonet in the Ia Drang Valley. But the interesting thing about it is it consistent with every other search and destroy operation. Remember, search and destroy is the Westmoreland concept, from 1965 until 1968. But I would argue it goes on into 1969, essentially under Abrams as well. But the central problem is always finding the enemy. So even when they embark on this operation, they have these guys on slicks, on helicopters, ready to dart into the Ia Drang Valley and envelop whatever NVA regiments they find there, they don't find any NVA. So, Silver Bayonet, they're like plodding around on these jungle paths and through clearings in the highlands for a couple of weeks before they finally bump into a couple of NVA stragglers. And then that's how they go, well, there's NVA somewhere around here because we just found these guys. And it turns out their company is in close proximity to two entire regiments of NVA. So they rush troops out there to get into contact with these guys, because that's the whole idea. You have to find them and you have to fix them in place. And the whole idea behind this air mobile warfare is that the U.S. infantry, the grunts, the guys the guys fighting on the ground with their M14 rifles or M16 rifles, these guys are not actually intended to do a lot of damage. They're the so-called tethered goat. You just sort of tether them in a clearing, and you encourage the enemy to come and think, oh, we've got the Americans outnumbered, and sort of wrap their strength around these Americans. And then you pummel the enemy with artillery and airstrikes. That's the idea. And that's exactly how Ia Drang is drawn up. But the problem is that already, and here, remember, we're at the very beginning of this war. We've put in the first troops in February of 65. This battle is in November of 65. And already in this battle, the NVA have learned how to fight the Americans, how to minimize their own casualties and maximize American casualties.
And the 7th Cavalry is surrounded by 2 regiments who come in waves right up to the end, the edge of the firing by the Americans. There's one platoon, I believe, that's isolated, and Hal Moore spends time trying to rescue it. They can't. They create casualties rescuing. They're covered by artillery. There's a fire base within reach. And so they're calling the artillery in on the NVA. And I want to emphasize here again and again, Jeff, it's in your book, this is a massacre with heavy weaponry and airships, gunships that come in, and the North Vietnamese keep coming. Was that a consideration? We have about a minute here. Was that a consideration to Westmoreland and his staff back at MACV, the fever and passion of the NVA troops walking into those shells?
Well, I mean, they understood, Westmoreland and the Americans understood the passion that these North Vietnamese troops had for what they were doing. But what was, as the historian, what was most interesting to me about the battle was that the North Vietnamese were not throwing themselves away. They still launched these human wave attacks, but usually against a vulnerable point. Remember this
30 seconds, Jeff, 30 seconds.
Yeah, these Americans were surrounded. And what the North Vietnamese do is they get right up into the American perimeter, really close. And then you mentioned the lost platoon. They wrap themselves around that lost platoon on the right flank as well. And they make it impossible for the Americans to use their supporting fires, artillery, tactical air, without bombing and shelling their own guys. And so they see this, that from captured prisoners interrogated after the battle, this is going to be the plan. Cling to the Americans, hold them by the belt so they can't use their supporting fires.
1966 and 1967, more troops coming in all the time. A man named Westmoreland is in charge of the MACV. He's supported by his president and the national security advisor and the chief of staff of the Army, the Joint Chiefs. More and more troops, Army troops, Marine troops, and a new kind of war, a helicopter war. The fleet's off the coast of Vietnam launching airstrikes all the time, rolling thunder. The operations have romantic names such as Paul Revere 1, 2, 3, 4, or Hawthorne. The operations resemble what we've just seen in the Ia Drang Valley. So what are the phases that Westmoreland plans to show to his politicians how he's going to win the war? Phase 1 we've seen. It's the buildup. What is phase 2, Jeff?
Well, as you say, phase 1 is the buildup, and the buildup is not to be sneezed at because it requires like building dozens of air bases around Vietnam, container ports, base camps, petroleum and ammunition storage depots all over the country. So the country, South Vietnam, the country about the size of Montana, is carved into this. They built something like 8,000 fire bases in the course of the war. And you still see these all over the country when you drive around southern Vietnam today. You'll see on every hilltop there's the remains of an asphalt helipad and a perimeter fence where they would have these networks of artillery. So wherever you launched an operation in any part of South Vietnam, you were within range, 15 miles basically of one of these fire bases. And then you have to have airstrips for fixed wing aircraft. And then you need container ports so that you don't just bring your supplies over the beach, but you can have warehouses and you have so that's like phase 1. In addition to these early, uses of the air mobile concept in battles like Ia Drang. And then you're going to proceed to this like sort of swinging attack on the enemy where you've got enough American personnel and equipment in country that you can now take the fight to the enemy. And this is the idea, Johnson like clings to this hope, throughout, the rest of his presidency, that he's going to be able to land a blow so punishing to the communists that they're going to say, you know what, let's just negotiate and agree to a two-state solution for Vietnam, and and get on with living. But so this next phase is going to be, you're going to launch these really crushing operations that are going to kill so many North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas that recruiting for the Viet Cong is going to dry up, and North Vietnam is going to become unwilling to keep sending guys down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But that's phase two, and that's going to be 1966, 1967. And Westmoreland talks about ending the war by 1968, basically when you can now take the U.S. combat forces that had been killing NVA and Viet Cong, and you can now like unleash them against the guerrillas and create village security and a pacification campaign. And then you've got the country now under control by 68, and that's when the U.S. hands over the war to an improved, well-trained, motivated South Vietnamese army, and the U.S. exits the war, leaving behind this like viable South Vietnam. That's the plan, but we never even get within sniffing distance of that plan because of the difficulties of this war. Chief among them, that search and destroy is premised on finding the enemy and destroying the enemy, and then the whole metric of success will be body count. The problem is 90% or more of U.S. and ARVN search and destroy operations between 1965 and 1969 make no contact with the enemy. It's a swing and a miss, because the enemy knows. They know what's coming. They can see an American search and destroy operation or ARVN search and destroy operation shaping up, because it's always preceded by the construction of these fire bases, the construction of a battalion headquarters, company bases, around the battalion headquarters, walks in the sun by the grunts, patrolling, looking for the enemy, otter spy planes overhead, looking down, looking for the enemy. They know exactly what's coming, so they disappear. And they wait for the Americans to exhaust themselves, and they go somewhere else. So we do have big operations, which I talk about in the book, but even some of the biggest ones, like Junction City in 1967, they're most notable for like really not finding the enemy, because the enemy bugs out and says, let's get out and we'll live to fight another day. That's the whole North Vietnamese theory of victory. Live to fight another day, protract the war, make it financially and politically painful in the United States by running up the casualties, running up the costs, and fraying their patience.
In the future is a disaster for Cambodia. And we noted here, remember, this is a political war. Lyndon Johnson knew the man Prince Sihanouk, who was the head of the regime in Cambodia, the neighboring Cambodia. The favorite was General Lon Nol in 66, a prime minister. However, he couldn't have him right away because Sihanouk was in charge and the people worshipped him. There was a rebellion in the country, Khmer Rouge, that will lead to the massacre of millions of people in the future. I mentioned it here. There's not time to divert into it, but the U.S. will eventually send an incursion into Cambodia. And Vietnam did not only destroy the Vietnamese people, it destroyed Cambodian people, Laotian people. And I mention that because at this point, Jeff, was the operations in Cambodia, any probes, the bombing, all of that, was that secret at this point in 66, 67?
Yeah, well, they're not even probing. I mean, Johnson doesn't want any violations of that border. They're not going to probe until Nixon starts the secret bombing in March of 1969, after taking office in January of that year, and escalates that throughout 69. And then 70, he sends troops, American troops, into Cambodia to attack the supply dumps, the NVA supply dumps, which are just over the border from South Vietnam.
So there was no attempt at this point to destabilize Cambodia. Is that correct?
No. That's what's one of the most interesting things. Revisionists will often kind of grasp at Cambodia and say, if only, we had gone into Cambodia harder and earlier and cleaned it out and done the same to Laos, then the NVA wouldn't have been able to infiltrate South Vietnam and wouldn't have been able to supply the Viet Cong insurgency along this Ho Chi Minh Trail, which runs along the South Vietnamese border through Laos and Cambodia, and then branches into South Vietnam. So we should have gone into those sanctuaries. We should have gone in and taken the sanctuaries. There was no taking these sanctuaries. These countries were these big, vast, largely uninhabited, trackless, roadless jungles, and the North Vietnamese army had made them their own. Like just by this, they built roads, they built pipelines, they built base camps, and everything else. We could go in, as we do in 1970, as the ARVN does in 1971, and we can capture a bunch of ammo and medicine and motor vehicle parks and whatnot, and burn the lot, and then go back out. But they're just going to come back in again. And the only way to sort of prevent it happening is to take over these countries, because both countries are in the grip of China, which has predominant influence in both, and B, in the grip of their guerrilla armies, the Pathet Lao in Laos, communists, and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, communists. And the only way to keep these people on the sidelines was to concede the neutrality. The neutrality is frankly being abused by the North Vietnamese, but the U.S. simply doesn't have the forces, the money, or the patience to go in and hold these places for a long period of time. And the U.S. risks international odium by going into these technically neutral countries and invading them, as we do in 1970 and 71, earning that international odium for no net gain, because all the inroads we make are rapidly made good by the enemy after we leave. So this was something that Johnson was aware of, and revisionists seem to suggest that he's somehow weak-kneed or irresolute, when in fact it was just he was facing facts. Kennedy had negotiated the neutrality of Laos in 1961, and within like 2 months of the treaty being signed, the communists were violating it, and Kennedy could not. He had nothing to do about it, because he would have had to go in, and he asked the Joint Chiefs, "What would it take for me to go in and get a real neutrality in Laos so the communists would stop using it to infiltrate South Vietnam?" And the Joint Chiefs said, at least 60,000 U.S. troops, at least, at a minimum. That's the down payment. And Kennedy's like, well, obviously, I'm not going to do that. So the only thing they could do was observe the neutrality, try to fight the war inside South Vietnam, but really try to sort of bolster the South Vietnamese military and make them stand on their own, which is exactly what we don't do in the Vietnam War.
It is January 1968. A man by the name of Lee Duan is in charge of the North Vietnamese military, in charge of the country. He's a communist, but he's a nationalist. The U.S. thinks it's Ho Chi Minh. He's essentially elbowed aside. The idea is to knock the U.S. out of the war with one offensive using the Viet Cong and the NVA. There's preparation for it, and it's not unknown by MACV. They can see it building up, but they believe they can handle it. And here it comes, 30 January 1968. It continues on to March. The shocking thing was they had a plan to get inside the U.S. Embassy, and they did. And the casualties in Vietnam, in Saigon, were unbelievably high for both sides, but especially for the NVA and the VC attacking. However, it showed up on American television, and that is probably the victory that North Vietnam, Lee Duan wanted. Was it conscious on his part, Jeff? Is there paper to say that the NVA and the Hanoi knew that getting onto television was a win?
Yes, I mean the North Vietnamese follow this the script of Maoist revolutionary warfare throughout this war, but they add something that Mao hadn't been quite so adept at, and that's this sort of global information warfare, where where they're talking about how they're just basically fighting a war against this neo-colonial power, and they have to defeat them. So they're trying to like really give a shock to the system. And the other thing is, for the North Vietnamese, if you just sort of think, it often sounds like the U.S. is really losing this war, and the North Vietnamese are winning the war. But that wasn't really apparent to the North Vietnamese. Life was bad in North Vietnam in 1966, 1967, 1968. everything was short. This Operation Rolling Thunder, this Johnson air campaign, was knocking out critical infrastructure in the north, making it very hard to move food and other things around the country. The population had been conscripted for the military. So, women were working in factories, women were working in the fields, small children, schools were being combed through to find, guys that could go into the military. So there was a feeling in North Vietnam that they really needed a quick knockout blow, and that a shock administered. Yeah, this is Lee Zuan's strategy. If we can just give them, a real bloody nose at Tet, this will like knock out the South Vietnamese military, which the North Vietnamese had contempt for. And we can't beat the Americans because the Americans are just too well armed, too mobile. The firepower is too great. They can recover almost any mistake they make on the battlefield with just more stuff and more firepower, but will demoralize them. And so that's the idea behind it. You'll accept a bloodbath because they know they're going to get bled badly. They're going to attack over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam, starting July 31st, 1968, and the Tet Offensive really breaks out in the first days of February all over South Vietnam, and they attack everywhere and they take huge casualties. But their calculation is that in this arena of information warfare, we're going to win because Lyndon Johnson had brought General Westmoreland back to the United States in 1967. He spent much of the year away from MACV, away from Saigon. He was campaigning for Johnson and going around, going to the National Press Club, giving an address to the joint sessions of Congress, going on television, talk shows, interview shows, and talking about how we've really turned the corner in Vietnam and the end is coming into view. We're reaching the crossover point, and that just one last thrust would maybe win the war, and that was the message they wanted to take into the elections in 1968. Was that we were on the front foot and we were almost there. And so what Tet does is it shows with Viet Cong sappers breaking into the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon after this publicity tour by Westmoreland talking about how we're winning this war. And suddenly you're fighting for the U.S. Embassy. VC troops are attacking toward the presidential palace. The North Vietnamese regulars have taken over the city of Hue, which is sort of the northern capital of South Vietnam, the old imperial forbidden city. Suddenly it looks ridiculous, and that's the occasion for Walter Cronkite's trip to South Vietnam, the most respected, revered anchor man on network television in the United States. And he travels from Saigon up to Hue and all over the place, visiting U.S. troops in the field. And that's when he says, look, I think it's time to accept that we can do nothing better than a stalemate. And that we should just content ourselves with ending the war as quickly as possible and telling ourselves that we did all that we could do to achieve an honorable end. And then that's when Johnson sees that broadcast in the White House and says, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And indeed he had.
A demonstration of rage on both sides is the Battle of Khe Sanh that is part of Tet from January until July of 1968. The base has no strategic or tactical advantage. In fact, it's abandoned right after the battle ends. But for months, certainly for weeks, the Marines and the Army at Khe Sanh are pounded by North Vietnam artillery. At the same time, the North Vietnamese closing on the encampment. It's a perimeter. It's a siege. Are pounded by the air power that is brought in and the artillery fire from Khe Sanh. I read your account. It's hard to read, Jeff, because both sides are wasting people, human beings, young men, both sides. The fact that the Americans stand up and don't abandon it is a puzzle to me, because we know afterwards they quit it. Has that ever been explained why they held on and didn't just evacuate?
Well, I mean, it had to be because Westmoreland was assailed for that. That as the battle ends, he's being kicked upstairs to be chief of staff of the army, and he's being replaced by his deputy Creighton Abrams, who will take over after Khe Sanh. But the reason they held on to Khe Sanh was it was the sort of westernmost anchor of the U.S. presence in North Vietnam, close to the Laotian border. And Westmoreland had this idea that he would administer a real beating to North Vietnamese and have them on the ropes after Tet, and then he would get authorization from President Johnson to go into Laos and block the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and then isolate the battlefield in South Vietnam by pinching off all these North Vietnamese supplies and fillers coming down the trail that he would block in Laos. That was his plan. That was why he claims he held on to Khe Sanh. But as one of the Marine generals at Khe Sanh said, when you're at Khe Sanh, you're not really anywhere, because it was a very fluid part of the battlefield where if the North Vietnamese felt threatened from Khe Sanh, they could just bypass it further to the west through Laos, which they always did. So hanging on to this place was bad for that reason, but also because it was within artillery range of NVA batteries in Laos. And if you just moved a little bit to the east, you'd be beyond the range of those batteries. But Westmoreland really thought, well, Khe Sanh is an opportunity. I know these guys, these Marines are trapped there, and they're encircled by two divisions of NVAs that are bombarding the place and sapping up close to the perimeter line to try to storm it. So I can freeze them in place there, and then I can hit them with B-52s, because the Battle of Khe Sanh, which is the Marines call Operation Scotland, but the Air Force calls Operation Niagara, because they're just unleashing this deluge of bombing over the NVA around it. So Westmoreland sees opportunity at Khe Sanh. I can kill them, but he doesn't achieve his effect. He ends up fighting them to a stalemate. He does kill a lot of them, but they kill a lot of Americans.
30 seconds.
And then, in terms of morale, it's a real stinker, because the U.S., bravely fights to hold this Khe Sanh combat base. And then the minute the NVA are driven off, they abandon it and they bulldoze it, and which is a perfect example and a symbol of the ultimate futility of the Vietnam War from the American perspective.
March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson surprising even his closest counselors, taking to the television to announce that he's stopping the bombing of Vietnam, seeking a peace table in Paris or wherever, and that he will not be a candidate for the presidency in 1968. He is a casualty of the Tet and of poor choices these last years with Westmoreland. Richard Nixon wins the election. However, there's a detail here that's important. Jeff, a very good evening again to you, and the detail was not revealed until the 21st century. I believe it was found by an author doing a biography of Richard Nixon, that prior to the success of the Nixon campaign over Hubert Humphrey, the vice president who ran on the Democratic ticket, Mr. Nixon had been in conversation with Anna Chennault, using her as a conduit to President Tu of Vietnam, South Vietnam. And what was the purpose of those conversations, Jeff?
Yeah, well, Nixon was deeply concerned that he'd been ahead in the polls against Hubert Humphrey for all of the 1968 campaign. But then once Johnson announces the bombing halt in October of 1968, on the eve of the elections in November, suddenly Humphrey starts climbing in the polls. And Nixon had been exploring this ways to derail these peace talks, which might result in what he called a November surprise, with Humphrey getting this big bounce from a Johnson peace deal, and then surpassing Nixon in the polls at the last minute. So he'd been looking for ways to do this, and he was lucky because there was a Republican that was embedded in the Democratic peace delegation in Paris, which was run by Averell Harriman. And this Republican mole was a guy named Henry Kissinger, who at the time was a professor of government at Harvard. And he was working as kind of an informal diplomat for Dean Rusk, who was LBJ's Secretary of State. And Rusk attaches Kissinger to Harriman's delegation. So from inside, Kissinger, he was a Rockefeller, a Nelson Rockefeller guy who was a rival of Nixon, and he'd run against Nixon for the Republican nomination in '68. He'd lost. So Kissinger was on the outs with the Nixon people, who were more representative of that sort of Western Republican strand, not the Northeastern, more liberal Republican strand of Rockefeller. So Kissinger had to find a way to get in with the Nixon team. So he says, "Look, I can tell you guys what's going on. I can help monkey wrench these peace negotiations, if I can then have a role in the Nixon administration." So the deal is done. And Kissinger starts telling them, "Hey, watch out! They're chilling the champagne here. They're really close." And then that's when Nixon and Haldeman, reach out to Anna Chennault, reach out to the South Vietnamese ambassador in D.C., get a message to Chu saying, scupper these peace talks. Don't come to Paris. Don't agree to sit with the VC and the North Vietnamese and the Americans at the peace table in Paris to end the war. Denounce it as a false peace. Wait on Nixon. Nixon will get you a better deal. And so, what I argue in the book is because in 1973, Nixon's going to, get the peace accords, which end the American participation in the war in January 73. It's the exact same peace deal that Johnson was about to get from Lee Zuan in October, November 1968. It's the exact same deal. And instead, we fight for another, 4 years, and we give up another 28,000 dead and a couple 100,000 wounded Americans, to say nothing of all the Vietnamese killed and maimed in this war or turned out of their homes, just so that Nixon can get elected. And that's really the thing that's most disgusting, is how all these people have to suffer. All these lives have to be ruined so that Nixon can get himself elected in place of Hubert Humphrey.
A better plan, a better war, a better deal. The Nixon plan to end the war. We go immediately to the Battle of Hamburger Hill, May of 1969. Nixon is inaugurated January of 69. This is the spring of 69. It's an operation that is indistinguishable from the Ia Drang Valley of 1965. And again, it's indistinguishable from Khe Sanh because there's no point to it. It's a ridge. But the military, the U.S. military, sends wave after wave of young people climbing a hill against dug-in North Vietnamese troops, or what they call themselves, the People's Army of Vietnam at the time. Jeff, I've read this again the way I read Khe Sanh. Wasted lives, broken ambitions. Even the wounded will be scarred by this the rest of their lives. Has there ever been an adequate explanation for why they did this?
Well, if you talk to the responsible American commanders at Hamburger Hill in May of 1969, whether we're talking about Westmoreland as Chief of Staff of the Army in D.C., you're talking about Creighton Abrams, the field commander at MACV, we're talking about Melvin Zeiss, the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, who directs his brigadiers to fight this battle. They all think the battle makes perfect sense. They say, look, that's the whole concept of this war, search and destroy. We found the enemy on Hamburger Hill, so we're going to kill the enemy. But you said it had something in common with Ia Drang Valley. Not exactly, in that Ia Drang Valley was kind of this encounter battle where we kind of bump into them and they bump into here. The North Vietnamese were in prepared bunker positions. They knew that we were going to take the bait and attack this hill. And so they were waiting for us. And, they inflict something like well over 300 casualties killed or wounded on Americans in this fighting for this meaningless hill, as you put it. But again, these generals all said, it doesn't matter. The hill's meaningless. We found the enemy there, and that's where we fought him, because the whole idea is to kill more of the enemy than he can kill of us. And yet, for Americans now who had elected Nixon on his promise that he had a secret plan to end the war, this looked like just more of the same. This looked like more of search and destroy, more, fruitless casualties for this fleeting advantage that would then just quickly evaporate because the enemy would pull away and regroup and come in somewhere else and provoke yet another battle like this. And so what's significant about Hamburger Hill is that Nixon had come in saying, you know what, I'm going to fight this war better than Johnson. Johnson was too lily-livered. He pulled his punches. He was too frightened about like Chinese intervention in the war. I'm just going to fight it harder. And I'm going to use all the military levers at my disposal to bring those guys to the peace table. Well, after Hamburger Hill, after the outcry in the United States, after the outcry in the press and Congress, Ted Kennedy leads the charge in Congress saying, how is it possible that we could send these waves of boys up this hill to be slaughtered for a place that has no tactical or strategic significance and will have no bearing on the ultimate outcome of this war? And Nixon is really blown back by all this. And then, so suddenly, all the tools of his secret plan become a lot less useful because the plan is premised on increased coercion. But we can't coerce because we can't take casualties because public opinion at home in the United States won't take it.
Quickly, we have not spoken of the military of South Vietnam, nor the local militia called the Rough Puffs. And the reason is they don't come out and fight much. They're not on the scene. And the American commanders don't trust to work with them. Is that correct by this time of the war, Jeff?
Well, yes. I mean, it's they had a hard job. I mean, the Rough Puffs, which was a kind of a pejorative American thing, but it sort of stuck because it was alliterative. But it was like they were the regional force RF, popular force PF. So Rough Puff together. This was like a militia force, 2 million strong by the end of the war, paid for and armed by the Americans with M16 rifles and law rockets and lots of good equipment. But the problem was they were completely infiltrated by the enemy. And so you would have the Viet Cong would force desertions from their midst, or they would terrorize these people into giving up their arms or going to sleep at night and letting the VC come into the village. Because they were the people that were far from the urban centers, far from the Arvin. They were very exposed. So most of them sort of made their peace with the enemy. And one of the things I did in my research is I read all these inspection reports, not only American inspection reports of these regional force, popular force militia units, but also joint, South Vietnamese Joint General Staff inspections by Arvin inspectors. And they were all pretty grim. They all were just saying, look, there's a lot of these guys. They have lots of equipment, but they bleed weapons everywhere. They don't have good discipline. They don't patrol. They have lots of patrols, and they never make contact with the enemy. It's obvious they're trying not to make contact with the enemy. So it was the militias were another thing that was a perfect example of how we created all these metrics, and we made the metric the measure of success. So how many guys like this can we arm? How many M16s can we distribute? How many fortified posts can we stand up? How many perimeters can we build? And then we'd add all these up and we'd present this as sign of progress. See, we've created this many battalions of regional force and this many platoons of popular force and put them in these places. We're winning. But in fact, these people were sort of paper soldiers that could be brushed aside quite easily by determined Viet Cong troops whenever they wanted to.
Spring, summer of 1970. And Jeff has outlined the Ho Chi Minh Trail that winds through Cambodia and Laos and then has exit points into Vietnam. The ambition for the generals since the beginning was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They tried to do it with air power. It wasn't successful. The Vietnamese, the Viet Cong and the NVA needed far fewer supplies daily and monthly than the U.S. and ARVN forces, and they could handle the bombing, and they did very well. Until 1970, the idea was to incur Cambodia, cut the trail, and isolate the so-called the commanders of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and of the Vietnamese. What's important here also is this rocked the protests in the United States back home. Students, long hairs, it plunged the U.S. into a division that is still extant in my measure, certainly my generation, the boomers, because Mr. Nixon and Henry Kissinger had promised an end to the war. This looks like an entirely new war. That's my observation, Jeff. You have very carefully compiled the facts here, but I'm pointing to the division that were created from the Cambodia exercise, the division that was created not just in the Congress, but all across America, setting the two sides angry at each other, and they were powerless to change the future. Nixon and Kissinger were the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's, when you think about Cambodia, if revisionists will often argue if we'd only gone into Cambodia or Laos sooner, we could have terminated this war. And that's because, the Ho Chi Minh Trail comes down from North Vietnam through Laos into Cambodia. And as you say, branches into South Vietnam from there. But there's also a trail coming up from the port of Sihanoukville, which is on, in the Gulf of Thailand in Cambodia. And you come up, Chinese ships could land there, unload supplies. These would be driven up roads in Cambodia to the border with South Vietnam, provided to the VC and the NVA that were operating in the Mekong Delta or the Three Corps in southern South Vietnam. So there was this feeling, there'd always been a feeling, we need to go in there. But the problem was, and this is exactly what happened in 1970, we go in and the North Vietnamese just bug out. They kind of move across, they move, they move westward, away from the frontier, deeper into Cambodia. And they allow the U.S. to come in, and it makes these enormous discoveries of weapons and other and munitions and all the food supplies and the medicine and field hospitals and motor parks and just basically barrack areas and bunkers and everything. They find all this stuff, burn it, blow it up. But just as always happens, the NVA will absorb that blow, and then after the Americans leave, because there are very strict rules of engagement on Cambodia, there's not enough U.S. force in South Vietnam to fight a campaign in Cambodia and fight in South Vietnam. So they're told, just go in 19 miles, don't stay longer than a couple of weeks, come back out. And so they just wait and they rebuild everything. And this is, again, the whole story of the war. They have this strategic patience, the enemy, that the United States does not have. The United States needs a quick, decisive victory. They need to sort of get some solution and get out to appease their voters, to appease Congress, to appease the media, to appease all the interest groups. And whereas in North Vietnam, there's only one issue: winning this war and unifying Vietnam. So they'll go on forever. And this is exactly what happens. We make big scores in Cambodia. We have 2,000 killed or wounded in this operation. And it does a big, as Abrams says, it's a big service to the ARVN in that it sets back the North Vietnamese army because it takes away a lot of their critical supplies. But all this stuff is replenished, and they just come on the following year in even greater force, because one thing how they react to the Cambodian incursion is they just sort of make new supply lines through Laos to compensate for the ones briefly lost in Cambodia. And one other thing is the interesting thing about the Cambodian incursion is that, you mentioned the long hairs, the college protest movement. It really turbocharges the protest movement, because as you mentioned, people had thought, oh, Nixon had a plan to end the war. Now he's widening the war. He's carrying the war from South Vietnam into neutral Cambodia, opening a whole nother front. And that's why you have these protests at places like Kent State University in Ohio, where 4 students are shot and killed with live ammunition by National Guard troops. And this triggers a really big outcry in America. But one of the things that's most sort of perverse and interesting about it is that there's as much support for Nixon in this. And if you look at the reaction to Kent State and shootings at other universities where the Guard fired live ammunition at students, like Jackson State in Mississippi, there's a lot of public support. Middle America, Time Magazine makes Middle Americans its Man and Woman of the Year after the Cambodian incursion, because it shows that there's 100 million Americans that still support Nixon and still loathe this youth movement and this protest movement, and they want to give Nixon time to end this war. And that's when Nixon starts talking about the silent majority. And then one final point on that: there's the hard hat riots in May of 1970.
30 seconds.
After the Cambodian incursion, where the hard hats, the factory workers and the construction workers, turn out in mobs to beat up the anti-war protests that are breaking out in cities around the United States. And there's one, most famously in New York City.
It is now 1971, winter, and another country is violated: invasion of Laos. It's called something I never knew about, Lam San 719. I only knew it as Laos. However, this is a disaster times 10, because it demonstrates that the ARVN are not ready to fight without the Americans. And that fact is denied. Nobody brings it up back in Washington during the Vietnamization. What was Vietnamization? What was the theory, Jeff?
Well, Vietnamization was the idea that became a part of Nixon's secret plan to end the war. The pieces were that he was going to fight harder than Johnson. He was not going to observe the same strict rules of engagement. He was going to bomb more. He might even reintroduce bombing to North Vietnam, which Johnson had suspended in October of '68. He would try to detach Hanoi from its superpower patrons, Moscow and Beijing, through diplomacy to those the opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union, and that he would then prepare the South Vietnamese military for life without America. So he would make massive deliveries of weapons and materiel to the South Vietnamese military so that it could fight like Americans and stand alone without American support. So Operation Lam Son 719 in the spring of 1971. This is going to be a Laotian incursion, like the Cambodian incursion of 1970, the previous year, and it was going to have American support. But Congress, after the Cambodian incursion, said, no more incursions across the border into these neutral nations. But because of a House amendment, they allowed there to be U.S. Aircraft operating in Laos or Cambodia. And so that's why when Lam Son 719 goes in, it has all the helicopters are flown by Americans. All the tactical airstrikes are flown by Americans. I mean, there is some South Vietnamese participation, but it's overwhelmingly American. And the casualties are horrible because the North Vietnamese air defenses are so good now that they're shooting down like hundreds of American helicopters. Of like the 650 American helicopters involved in the operation, like 626 of them were either shot down or really badly damaged by ground fire. So they're going to go in and they're going to reprise what happened in 70 in Cambodia. They're going to look for these big sort of base camps and supply dumps and capture them, burn them, tear them up. And they're going to take this town called Chapon, which is like this crossroads in Laos, just west of the South Vietnamese border, which is like a major junction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the South Vietnamese military is going to go there and take it and block the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So what happens is it's a first look at Vietnamization, and it's a total failure because the Americans give the South Vietnamese all the stuff that makes the Americans so good, but they don't have the animating spirit, the staff work, the leadership, the very finely tuned transitions between the various branches to fight one of these very highly fire intensive mobile battles. And so what the South Vietnamese do is they take all this modern armament, but they kind of proceed in a very kind of 19th century way. They kind of march down the road and stop, and they dig in, and they make fire bases, and then they wait for a while, and then they keep going. And the only thing that's going to work in an incursion like this is speed, because the minute the North Vietnamese recognize that it's the South Vietnamese operating alone, threatening their supply line in an area that's been secured by the NVA for decades, and where they have a lot of troops, they've got 2 divisions. They can wrap around this force of about 16,000 ARVN troops. They're going to surround them and destroy them, which is, inevitably what happens. It becomes a rout. They're completely pushed out. Their forces halved by North Vietnamese attacks, and it's a great blow to South Vietnamese morale because it was supposed to showcase the budding success of Vietnamization. And instead, it shows the opposite.
It is the spring of 1972, and Le Duan, the leader of North Vietnam, launches another knockout blow we call it the Easter Offensive. They had their own name. And it's to drive on Saigon. It's to get as close as you can, maybe all the way to the big stuff at Cam Ranh Bay and Hue, and Da Nang. The U.S. Is in an election mode. Richard Nixon means to continue his presidency. So he authorizes Linebacker 1. What was the difference between bombing for Johnson and bombing for Nixon at this point, Jeff?
Well, Johnson had in October, he'd done a bombing halt over most of North Vietnam, except for the sort of southern panhandle. And then in November of 68, he goes to a total bombing halt over North Vietnam. Because that was their demand. We're not going to negotiate peace if you're still bombing us. So stop bombing, and we'll come and we'll talk. And then, whereas Nixon says, okay, well that's one of the problems is that we're not fighting them hard enough. So we're going to put bombing back on the table. So Linebacker 1 is basically in the course of this Easter offensive, Nixon says we're going to start bombing North Vietnam again. We're going to go up by the DMZ and we're going to bomb around there. He still spares the big urban centers, but then Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombing of 1972, when he's trying to get a peace deal with the North and they're kind of dragging their feet on a couple of issues, he takes the bombing right up to Haiphong Harbor and Hanoi and and kills thousands of North Vietnamese civilians in this 2-week bombing campaign around Christmas to try to force them to the peace table. So linebackers is one of the areas where Nixon is able to actually assert more force. When he tries to escalate on the ground, he's blown back by student protests, by the moratorium marches in the United States, where normal Americans, not like long-haired students, but just normal middle-class American families, turn out in these big mass protests all across the United States and around the world against the war. But the one thing he can do is he can increase bombing, and he's absolutely pitiless about that.
Nixon visits China and sits with Mao. Nixon heads to Moscow and advances détente. What was his thinking? Why did he do that in the midst of the Vietnam War?
Well, I think, I just remember how before I wrote this book, I thought of the opening to China as Nixon kind of trying to widen the rift between Moscow and Beijing and kind of align the United States with China, which was against the Soviet Union, which was the more imposing threat. So we could, China was still a relatively weak power. It was big and populous, but the economy was weak and they were kind of like disconnected from the world economy. And the Soviet Union seemed to be a much bigger global threat. So we align ourselves with Beijing against Moscow and we thus attenuate the Soviet Union's power. But when I wrote this book, Vietnam bulks larger and larger. So I argue in the book, when we think about all the sort of inconsistencies today and all the sort of ambiguity and gray areas around Taiwan and how much support will we give to Taiwan. And a lot of this comes from this Nixon era when Nixon said to Mao, oh, well, we don't care about Taiwan. And we prepare to turn over the UN seat from Taiwan to mainland China. And we turn our back on Taiwan and we embrace mainland China. And for Nixon, a lot of the calculation is Mao will cease supporting the NVA and will help me get a peace in Vietnam that will help me to get the United States out of Vietnam and leave a viable South Vietnam behind it. So a lot of these things are done not to triangulate versus the Soviet Union, but to get a peace deal in Vietnam.
The North Vietnamese refuse to bow to Nixon's plan. And he and Kissinger then authorized Linebacker 2, which is to destroy Hanoi. That it was at the mission statement by the B-52s. There was nothing left when they finished bombing.
Well, not exactly destroy, but like they're going, before there had been these, if you looked at a map of the rules of engagement surrounding Operation Rolling Thunder, Johnson's air campaign against North Vietnam, there were big bands of territory that were prescribed. Like you could not bomb the border with China. Against railways crossed from China bringing supplies to the north. So you couldn't bomb those railways and bomb those rail cars because you might kill Chinese people and bring the Chinese into the war. Similarly, you could not mine Haiphong Harbor because if you dropped mines into Haiphong Harbor and you sank a Chinese or Soviet ship, you might bring them into the war against you. You couldn't bomb the population centers because the international outcry would have been too much. And again, you might have killed, Russians or Chinese and brought them into the war. So there were these no-go zones. And Nixon says, no, we're going to bomb now. He's not, there are targets, but, they're bombing so close to the population overlay, they're going right into urban parts of Hanoi and Haiphong that they're bound to be. I think that in these linebacker raids, something like 4,000 or 5,000 North Vietnamese civilian casualties. But on the other hand, people credit Nixon with getting them to agree to end the war. Because after this, Lee Zuan says, okay, let's just table the rest of our objections and take this deal, get the Americans out, and then we can push South Vietnam over at the next opportunity without the Americans behind them and without American air power behind them.
We now remember that this is a political war, not a war of existential risk for the U.S. And what is to be learned from fighting a political war? There have been a few since. One of the things is that the U.S. will make promises at the peace table, but those promises are not easily found in the historical record. There's money promised. There's accommodation with the South. but there's no accounting for the man named Tu, the president of Vietnam, who was also the commander of the forces as the defense of Saigon collapses in 1973. And again, there's so much bombing that the North Vietnamese are bloodied. They're actually damaged. And one of their generals tells Li Duan, it's going to take us maybe a year or two to recover. We've lost so many people. The massacre is obvious from the bombing. And Jeff includes remark by a letter found among the remains of one North Vietnamese unit where a young man said that when you see the planes, your heart sinks. You know that you're going to die or that it will be relentless. We have nothing to defend ourselves. But we come to 74, 75. And again, it's important to emphasize the ARVN wasn't ready and the collapse was obvious. It's obvious reading your book, Jeff. Was it obvious at the time that they would collapse the moment the North Vietnamese came again?
Well, I mean, the couple of things. The Easter Offensive in 72, the North Vietnamese were poised to win the war in 1972. And it's only this sort of last minute insertion of American air power. Because American air power had been taken out in the Vietnamization program. So lots of squadrons had come out, carrier battle groups had come out, and so there just wasn't a lot of American air power. All that stuff had to be rushed back in, and it intervenes decisively. You know, not just tactical air support, but B-52s flown back to Thailand and back to Guam for quick runs over NVA columns, advancing down into South Vietnam. So all that stuff has to be brought back. The cost is staggering. So again, a lot of people talk about, oh, well, the U.S. could have won the Vietnam War if only it had done this, that, or the other thing. All the scenarios involve doing more with more. And the more that we were dealing with at the time was already backbreaking financially. So the cost of putting all that air power back into Southeast Asia, it made analysts in the Pentagon and elsewhere say, what are we doing here? So
we're talking 74 now
we're talking the Easter Offensive of 72. Then there's the peace in 73, and then then the North Vietnamese arm again, saying the Americans are not going to come back. They're not going to come back, and then Nixon gets impeached, and so they launched this final offensive in 1975, confident that the Americans won't. But to test the new American president, Nixon's vice president, who had stepped in when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford, they launched a trial offensive to see if Ford will react. He doesn't react. They're still cautious. They don't want a reprise of the Easter offensive when all that American air power came out to fight them. They do another trial offensive. Ford doesn't react. Now it's quite clear, just because they can read the press, they can read the New York Times, they can read the Washington Post, they can read the records of debates in Congress about the war. They can see very clearly what's going on. The Americans aren't going to react. So they send this like full-on offensive with multiple pincers over the northern border and over the western borders from Laos and Cambodia and across the DMZ. And they basically crush South Vietnam between these pincers. What's notable about that 1975 campaign is the South Vietnamese military had been really well armed by the United States, but between 73 and 75, there's a real fall off in congressional support. We don't supply the spare parts. We don't supply the ammunition. We don't supply the fuel, especially fuel's gotten so expensive because of the oil shocks. And so this is an army that has lots of equipment, but can't drive it around and can't train. They can't fire. They can't train artillery. They can't train on the rifle range. They don't have the ammunition. So you have fighter pilots converted to infantrymen, for example. And so when the final attack comes, first of all, it's handled very badly. Chu initially defends the whole country. Then in the middle of the battle, he says, I'm going to abandon the whole northern half of South Vietnam, and I'm going to rebuild South Vietnam around where most of the population lives in the southern part, around Saigon and the Mekong Delta. And we're going to have a much smaller, more defensible country. Well, all the units that are streaming out of these northern provinces that he abruptly abandons, they're all broken up by North Vietnamese attacks, and they fall apart, disband, and they retreat as a complete ungovernable rabble. And then the roads themselves are clogged with refugees. And before long, the North Vietnamese army is gathered around Saigon, prepared for the final offensive to evict to and unify the country.
The scenes at the American Embassy in 1975, vivid scenes, lessons learned. You observed, Jeff, that one of the I read your copy, the great lesson of the war for Americans was how little all that violence and expenditure of lives and treasure affected events on the ground in Southeast Asia. Explain, please. We have a couple of minutes.
Well, the war was embarked upon, very cautiously at first, and always viewed as more of a political exercise. Well, we've got to signal to the enemy that we're tough. We got to signal to the enemy they can't push us around, and we're going to just keep reacting to the enemy's provocations and a little bit more, and we're gonna turn them back that way. And at some point, it begins to dawn on someone like McNamara, who's already a broken man by 1966, that he was wrong, that they're not going to be dissuaded by increasing American pressure. They're going to just do what they have to do to win this war, and they're going to go on and on and on. And this is what leads to the steady retreat of McNamara from the Secretary of Defense position and his replacement by Clark Clifford in 1968. McNamara is just broken by this war, but everybody is. They all realize by 1967 the war is unwinnable. And yet they push on, hoping for a lucky break, hoping that they can get through the next election cycle with it, showing that they're standing up to communism, and then they can look for ways to wind it down or get out. And the whole thing was never approached strategically. What is possible? What can we do? If it's not possible, how do we get out and keep our honor intact? It was always just sort of one more step down the road and hope for the best. And as we see, this led us into what was for a very long time America's longest war.
And you also point to the fact that this might have started with FDR, the idea that we were going to take on, the marshal on the beat, no matter who was in trouble, we were going to be there. Why were we in Vietnam? 30 seconds, Jeff. Has anybody ever come up with an adequate response to that?
Well, the domino theory, the idea that if we don't contain the spread of communism, it will just take over all of Southeast Asia. Not just Vietnam, but Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore. So we have to sort of hold the line there to stop the spread. And the problem is every situation is different, and we did not have a government in South Vietnam that we could attach ourselves to with any hope of ultimate success.
Geoff Warwo, The Vietnam War, A Military History. Highly recommended, especially to you boomers. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.